The condensation on the wine chiller had dripped exactly 6 times when Naomi Carter realized the man with the neck tattoos was about to eat his last meal. She didn't decide to save him all at once. The decision arrived in pieces, quietly tucked between one polite nod and the next, while she was carrying a vintage red she hadn't been paged to pour yet. She was good at pretending not to hear things she absolutely should not have heard. She had been doing it her entire life. She had spent years pretending not to notice the hard-faced men at her mother's door or the way the air changed when certain names were spoken in her neighborhood. To Naomi, working a private shift in a room filled with expensive suits and concealed holsters was just another Tuesday. The restaurant was an archive of old-world luxury, filled with the scent of truffle oil, aged oak, and a tension that felt less like high-end service and more like a fuse burning down. Tonight, the dining room belonged to Luca Vierley. He had claimed every table, every velvet chair, and every dark corner of the establishment. He wasn't the kind of man who shared oxygen, let alone space. You didn't live in this city without knowing the name Vierley. It was a name that moved through the streets like a cold draft. He wasn't famous like a movie star. He was famous like a landslide. You didn't talk about him because you wanted to, but because you had to know which way the earth was shifting. He sat at the center table, his sharp black suit contrasting against the intricate ink climbing his neck, his posture possessing the terrifying looseness of a predator that had never been surprised. Across from him sat an older associate, a man with a well-tailored exterior and eyes that gave away nothing of the soul behind them. They were deep into the course when Naomi arrived with the wine. The conversation paused for a heartbeat, exactly 1 second, while she poured, then resumed as if she had vanished. She knew the rule. These men spoke freely because they considered staff to be part of the furniture. Naomi didn't mind. Furniture heard everything. By the time the main course was served, she had already cataloged the threats. There were 4 armed men, 2 by the grand entrance, 1 shadowing the kitchen corridor and 1 by the terrace window. They were dressed for a gala, but their eyes moved with a specific, lethal intent. They didn't scan for exits. They watched specific people, communicating through the silent language of glances and shifts in weight. Naomi had grown up in a world where that silence was its own dialect. She understood it perfectly, and usually she wanted nothing to do with it. Naomi moved with a practiced, fluid grace that made her nearly imperceptible against the backdrop of dark wood and velvet. She had spent 28 years perfecting the art of being seen without being noticed, a skill she had honed long before she ever donned a server's waistcoat. In her world, invisibility wasn't a superpower. It was a survival strategy. As she glided past the heavy drapes of the dining room, she felt the familiar weight of her father's history pressing against her shoulders like a physical burden. He had been a man of grand dreams and even grander debts, leaving behind a ledger of red ink that followed Naomi like a persistent shadow through every street in the city. She didn't mind the silence of her work. To the men at the center table, she was merely an extension of the mahogany sideboard or the heavy silver candelabra, part of the furniture that filled the room but possessed no ears. She had learned early on that furniture heard everything. She heard the wet click of a safety being moved, the rhythmic tapping of a nervous associate, and the low, gravelly negotiations of men who traded in lives the way others traded in stock. She was a ghost in a white apron, refilling crystal glasses before they were even half empty, ensuring the flow of wine never faltered so the flow of secrets never stopped. Her manager, a man whose anxiety was as visible as the sweat on his brow, had whispered the standard warning in the kitchen: "Keep your head down, do not look them in the eye, and speak only if the world is ending." Naomi had simply nodded. She needed this shift. She needed the tips that came from serving men who didn't count their change, and she needed the safety of the shadows. But as she leaned in to adjust a porcelain charger, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong in a 5-star establishment. Beneath the cool, polished edge of the table, her skin met a texture she recognized with a jolt of pure, ancestral terror. It was a faint, tacky residue, colorless and nearly invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the touch. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her uncle, a dock worker, arriving home with that same sticky film on his palms after a special cleaning job, only to have his lungs seized 3 days later in a hospital bed while doctors scratched their heads at a natural failure. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, the smell of expensive rosemary turning into the metallic scent of an impending grave. The dining room of Lou Viewport did not belong to the city tonight. It belonged to Luca Vyerly. He had booked every table, every velvet chair, and every strip of shadow in the room, ensuring that he did not have to share his space with anyone he hadn't personally vetted. Naomi watched him from the periphery, nodding the way the light caught the dark ink of the tattoos climbing his neck, disappearing into a crisp collar that cost more than her 6-month rent. He sat at table 4 with the posture of a man who had never once been truly surprised in his life, loose, yet possessing a coiled, lethal control. To the rest of Marseille, Vyerly was a storm system. You didn't talk about him because you wanted to. You talked about him because you needed to know when the pressure was dropping and the wind was about to change. He dealt in shipping routes and money that moved through the old port as quietly as morning fog. Beside him sat an older associate with a wide, practiced smile that showed all his teeth but none of his soul, his narrow eyes cataloging the room with a suspicion that Naomi felt like a cold draft against her neck. Naomi moved toward them with a second bottle of red, her steps rhythmic and silent. As she approached, the conversation at the table stopped for exactly 1 second, a brief, heavy pulse of silence. Before resuming the moment, she stepped back into the shadows. She had long ago accepted that men like Vyerly viewed her as part of the furniture. They spoke of debts, loyalties, and quiet transitions of power as if she were a mahogany sideboard. But furniture heard everything, and Naomi was an expert at listening to the things people thought were buried. From her vantage point near the wine station, she counted the security. 4 men. Dressed well enough for a corporate gala, but with eyes that moved differently than standard bodyguards. They didn't watch the exits. They watched specific points and specific people, checking in with one another through glances that said everything without a single spoken word. Naomi understood that language. She had grown up in a neighborhood where a look could be a promise or a death sentence. Usually, she wanted nothing to do with it. But as she looked at the man at table 4, she realized the natural order of his world was about to be violently disrupted by the colorless residue she had felt beneath the wood. The man seated across from Luca Vyerly was a study in artificial warmth. He went by the name of Marcus Thorne, though Naomi knew that in this room, names were often just garments worn for the season. He was middle-aged, with silvering temples and a smile that reached his teeth but died long before it touched his eyes. While Vyerly sat with the heavy, honest stillness of a mountain, Thorne moved with a frantic, predatory energy. He leaned forward, his hands dancing near the edge of his plate, always near the edge, never resting fully upon the table. Naomi approached to clear the appetizer plates, her movements a silent choreography she had performed 1,000 times. As she reached for Thorne's dish, his gaze snapped to her. It wasn't the look of a diner acknowledging service. It was the look of a man checking a perimeter. His eyes, narrow and calculating, swept over her face, her hands, and the name tag pinned to her vest. He was looking for a crack in the furniture, a sign that the wallpaper had developed a mind of its own. "You're new to the Tuesday rotation, aren't you, Naomi?" Thorne asked. His voice was smooth, like polished stone, but there was a jagged edge beneath the surface. "I go where the floor manager needs me, sir," she replied, her voice a perfect neutral hum. She didn't look him in the eye. To look him in the eye would be to acknowledge her own humanity, and in this room, humanity was a liability. She felt his suspicion like a physical heat. He wasn't just watching her. He was monitoring the very air around the table. Beside him, Vyerly remained oblivious to the silent interrogation, his attention momentarily diverted by a notification on his phone. Thorne's smile widened, but his fingers twitched toward the underside of the table, the exact spot where Naomi had felt the tacky, lethal film. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted in Naomi's mind. The armed men at the door were not the primary threat. The danger was sitting right here, dressed in a bespoke silk blend, hiding behind the mask of a loyal associate. Thorne wasn't just a guest. He was a watcher, a man waiting for a clock to strike 0. As Naomi stepped away with the tray, she felt the weight of his stare burning into her back. He knew she was more than furniture, and she knew that if she made one wrong move, he would be the first to ensure she never left the restaurant alive. The invisible debt she carried suddenly felt lighter than the choice she was about to make. The main course arrived with a choreographed efficiency that masked the mounting dread in Naomi's chest. The air in the room felt heavy, saturated with the scent of seared wagyu and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. As she approached table 4, her movements were mechanical, a shield of professionalism she had worn so long it had become a second skin. She felt Thorne's eyes tracking her, a predator measuring the gait of its prey, but her focus was elsewhere. It was on the heavy, gold-rimmed porcelain plate she was about to set before Luca Vierley. As she leaned in to perform the delicate exchange of plates, the light from the overhead chandelier caught the underside of the china at a sharp, revealing angle. There, hidden in the shadow of the base ring, was a small, translucent smear. To anyone else, it would have looked like a stray drop of oil or a smudge from a careless thumb. But Naomi saw the way the light didn't just reflect off it. The substance seemed to absorb the glow, thick and unnervingly still. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands remained steady, the steady hands of a woman who had learned to pour wine while her world was collapsing. She recognized the specific, crystalline sheen of the toxin. It was the same ghost chemical that had been whispered about in the docks, a substance that didn't need to be ingested to kill. It only needed heat, the heat of a warm meal, to begin its invisible, lethal evaporation. Vierley reached for his silver fork, his tattooed hand hovering inches from the rising steam of the plate. Naomi felt a cold sweat break across her neck. In the silent language of the room, she saw the shift. Thorne wasn't just watching her anymore. He was leaning back, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all evening. He was waiting for the first breath. He was waiting for the natural collapse that would follow. The weight of her invisibility suddenly felt like a physical cage. If she spoke, she broke the code of the furniture and invited a bullet. If she stayed silent, she became an accomplice to a murder that would leave her and her coworkers as the only convenient bodies to blame. She stepped back into the shadows, the tray trembling ever so slightly in her grip. The image of that shimmering shadow under the china burned into her mind. She had exactly 90 seconds before the heat of the stake released the first invisible cloud, and for the first time in her life, Naomi Carter realized that staying quiet was the most dangerous thing she could do. The kitchen swing door settled into a muffled silence behind her, but the roar in Naomi's ears wouldn't stop. She stood by the stainless steel prep station, her breath coming in shallow, jagged pulls that tasted of sanitizing fluid and old grease. To any other server, that smear on the porcelain would have been a smudge of poorly dried dishwater. But Naomi's eyes had been trained by a ghost. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she wasn't in the pristine kitchen of a 5-star establishment. She was 12 years old, standing in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment where the air always smelled of laundry detergent and her uncle's heavy-duty hand soap. Uncle Elijah had been a foreman at the chemical transit docks, a man of ironclad habits and a booming laugh that could shake the walls. Then came the Tuesday he returned home with a strange, tacky film on his palms. He joked about a leak in a shipment of industrial vitamins, washing his hands with the green abrasive soap he always used. 3 days later, the laugh was gone. Naomi remembered the way his lungs had simply stopped cooperating, a natural respiratory failure that left the doctors baffled and the insurance companies silent. It was only weeks later, after the men in dark suits had visited her mother to offer a settlement for their silence, that Naomi found the discarded safety manual Elijah had tucked into his coat pocket. It described a colorless, heat-activated organophosphate, an industrial-grade shadow that left no trace in the blood after 6 hours. It was a poison designed for people the world wanted to forget. Opening her eyes, Naomi looked at her own hands. They were steady, but her skin felt cold. She realized now why Marcus Thorne was sitting so far back, why he hadn't touched the bread, and why he was watching the steam rise from Virley's plate with the rapt attention of a man watching a timer count down. The toxin wasn't just under the plate. It was reacting to the heat of the filet mignon. The legacy of her family's debt wasn't just the money she owed to the collectors at the door. It was the burden of knowing exactly how a man looked when he was being erased from the inside out. For years, she had survived by pretending she was part of the furniture, a silent witness to the world's cruelty. But as she gripped the handle of a fresh wine bottle, the weight of Elijah's memory shifted. She couldn't save her uncle, and she couldn't pay off the ghosts of her past, but she knew with a sudden, sharp clarity that she would not stand by and watch another, natural, death happen at her table. Not tonight. Not while she was the only one who could see the poison in the steam. The stainless steel of the kitchen prep table felt like ice under Naomi's palms. She stared at the digital clock above the pass-through. 90 seconds had already bled into 60. In the dining room, the heat from the steak was doing its silent work, turning a smear of gel into a lethal vapor. To her left, the head chef was barking orders, the clatter of pans and the hiss of the grill creating a wall of noise that felt miles away. Naomi was trapped in the quiet center of her own private storm. She could leave. That was the first thought, the survival instinct that had kept her family alive through generations of debt and shadow. She could slip out the service entrance, vanish into the humid night of the city, and never look back. By the time the sirens arrived at Lou Viewport, she would be 3 bus stops away. The furniture didn't have to stay for the wreckage. If she disappeared, she was just another waitress who couldn't handle the pressure of a high-stakes night. But then she thought of the skeleton crew in the front of the house. She thought of Maria, whose daughter needed braces, and Marcus, who was 3 months away from retirement. If Luca Virley died at his table, his men wouldn't call the police. They would lock the doors. They would look for someone to blame, and they would start with the people who touched the plates. To stay silent was to sign their death warrants alongside Virley. Her reflection in the polished surface of a refrigerator door looked back at her, eyes wide, skin pale. She saw the ghost of her Uncle Elijah in the line of her jaw. He had died because he didn't know the danger. She was about to let a man die even though she knew exactly what it was. Her father's debts had taught her that the world was divided into those who took and those who were taken from. But as she gripped the neck of a fresh bottle of Cabernet, she realized there was a third category, those who saw the hand before it struck. The air in the kitchen was hot, but Naomi felt a sudden, clinical chill. Her fear hadn't vanished. It had simply sharpened into a tool. She couldn't pay off the collectors or bring back the dead, but she could choose not to be a shadow. She checked her reflection one last time, smoothed her apron, and adjusted her professional mask. She had 40 seconds left. With the steady hands of a woman who had already decided she was willing to die, Naomi pushed through the swing doors and stepped back into the lion's den. The transition from the kitchen's sterile chill back into the dining room felt like stepping into a furnace. The air was thick with the scent of seared fat and the low, rumbling baritone of men who controlled cities. Naomi's pulse was a frantic hammer against her ribs, but her hands, those hands that had carried the weight of her family's survival for a decade, remained as steady as stone. She gripped the bottle of Cabernet like a talisman. Marcus Thorne was leaning back now, his smile a thin, surgical line of anticipation. He looked at his watch, a subtle flick of the wrist that told Naomi everything. The clock had run out. Luca Virley's hand was already moving, his fingers closing around the heavy silver fork, ready to take the first bite of the meal that would end him. Naomi didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for a page or a nod. She broke the cardinal rule of the Lou Viewport. She stepped into the light before she was summoned. The security guard near the kitchen corridor shifted, his hand moving instinctively toward the breast of his jacket, his eyes narrowing. Thorne's expression flickered from smug satisfaction to sharp, jagged irritation. But Naomi kept her gaze locked on the label of the wine bottle, her movements fluid and professional, a ghost haunting the banquet. She reached the table just as Virley began to lift a piece of the steak. Leaning down, she tilted the bottle toward his glass, her body creating a temporary wall between the boss and the rest of the room. It was a position of extreme vulnerability and extreme intimacy. For a second, she was close enough to smell his expensive cologne and see the individual lines of the ink on his neck. "More wine, Mr. Vyerly?" she asked, her voice the practiced hum of a servant. Vyerly looked up, his dark eyes alert and slightly confused by the interruption. Before he could speak, Naomi leaned even closer, the neck of the bottle clicking softly against the crystal rim. In a breath that was barely a sound, a vibration meant only for his ear, she spoke 4 words that shattered the quiet order of the evening. "Look under your plate." The world seemed to stop. Vyerly's fork stayed suspended in midair. He didn't turn to look at her, and he didn't call for his guards. He was a man who had survived by knowing the difference between noise and signal, and in Naomi's trembling but certain whisper, he heard the truth. Across the table, Thorne's face went from pale to a sickly, ashen gray. He didn't know what she had said, but he knew the rhythm of the room had changed. The predator at table 4 was no longer eating. He was beginning to hunt. The silence that followed Naomi's whisper was not an empty thing. It was a physical weight that pressed against the walls of the dining room. Luca Vyerly did not jump. He did not shout. He simply sat very still, his fork resting against the gold rim of the plate with a faint, musical chink that sounded like a gunshot in the hushed room. He looked at Naomi for a beat, a long, searching look that stripped away her uniform and her invisibility, seeing the person beneath the furniture for the first time. Then, with the agonizing slowness of a man who knew he was being watched, he set the fork down and leaned back. Across the table, Marcus Thorne's composure began to fray like an old rope. The wide, artificial smile he had worn all evening didn't just fade, it curdled. He looked from the untouched steak to Vyerly's cold, unreadable face, and then his gaze snapped to Naomi. His eyes were no longer narrow and calculating. They were wide with a frantic, cornered animalism. He knew the signal had been sent. Vyerly reached out, but not for his meal. He picked up his linen napkin and dropped it directly over the steaming plate, smothering the rising vapor. He then looked at the 2 guards by the entrance and made a single, sharp gesture, a flick of the fingers so subtle a casual observer would have missed it. "Marcus," Vyerly said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the chill of an open grave. "I think the air in here has become quite stale, don't you?" Thorne tried to speak, but the words died in a dry rattle in his throat. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the parquet floor. Before he could take a step toward the exit, the 2 men from the door were already behind him. There was no struggle, no shouting, and no scene. They didn't draw weapons. They simply took Thorne by the elbows with a firm, professional grip that suggested he was being escorted to a waiting car rather than his own end. "We have much to discuss regarding the shipping manifests," Vyerly added, his tone conversational and terrifyingly light. In a more private setting, the room watched in a collective held breath as Thorne was led toward the back corridor, the one that bypassed the kitchen and led directly to the alleyway where the black sedans waited. The furniture stood frozen, trays held like shields, as the traitor disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. The door clicked shut with a finality that made Naomi's knees feel weak. The threat was gone, but the silence remained, heavier than before, as Luca Vyerly turned his attention back to the waitress who had just saved his life. The heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant felt like the gates of another world as they closed behind Naomi for the last time. 2 weeks had passed since the night at table 4, and the city felt different, lighter, or perhaps she was the one who had finally shed a skin. She stood on the edge of the pier, the salt spray of the harbor misting against her face, watching the ferry churn the dark water into white foam. In her pocket was a heavy, unmarked envelope. It wasn't the life-changing sum of a movie protagonist, but it was enough. It was enough to settle the ghost of her father's ledgers and buy a ticket to a place where no one knew her name. Luca Vyerly had been a man of his word. In their final meeting in his shadowed office, he hadn't offered her a briefcase of cash or a ring to kiss. He had offered her a job, a seat at a different kind of table, where her invisibility would be a weapon instead of a shield. "You have a gift, Naomi," he had said, his voice like the low hum of a distant engine. "Most people look at the world, you see it. I could use someone who sees the things I miss." But Naomi had looked at the ink on his neck and the cold, clinical distance in his eyes and realized that accepting his protection was just another kind of debt. She had spent her life paying for things she didn't buy. She told him she didn't want a seat at the table. She wanted to forget the table existed. She had asked only for the safety of her coworkers and the chance to walk away without a shadow following her. The ferry's horn let out a low, mournful blast, signaling the final call. Naomi stepped onto the metal ramp, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath her boots. She didn't look back at the skyline or the glittering lights of the luxury restaurants that lined the shore. As the boat pulled away, the distance between her and her past began to grow. She thought of Uncle Elijah and the safety manual tucked into a coat pocket. She thought of the furniture she had left behind, now safe from the fallout of a dead boss. For the first time in 28 years, Naomi Carter wasn't pretending to be invisible. She was simply gone. She watched the wake of the boat erase the path behind her, moving toward a horizon where the only thing she had to serve was her own future. The debt was paid, the silence was broken, and the air finally was clean.